Right now, 11 million people in the United Kingdom are managing a football team. They have not paid a penny to do it. They spend an average of 30 minutes per week on it. They argue about it with their colleagues. They check it obsessively on their phones at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning. It is called Fantasy Premier League. It is completely free, and the organisation behind it, the Premier League, made £6.3 billion in revenue last season. Not from Fantasy Premier League, from everything Fantasy Premier League drives. Because here is the question nobody asks. If it's free, who is making the money? The answer is worth $67 billion. And it involves a rake, a data empire. Two American companies that started as fantasy sports platforms and became sports betting giants, and an Indian startup that built a 220 million user empire overnight, then had 90% of its revenue wiped out by a single law. This is the story of how the world's most popular free game became one of the most valuable businesses in sport. Let's start with the number that frames everything. The global fantasy sports market reached $28.95 billion in 2024. It is projected to grow at 9.29% per year and reach $67 billion by 2033. $67 billion. For games that are largely free to play, 84 million people across the United States and Canada alone played fantasy sports or sports betting in the past 12 months. 57 million of those played fantasy sports specifically. That is roughly 1 in 6 of the entire US adult population. Fantasy football monthly active users jumped 40% between August 2023 and August 2025, with some platforms growing over 80% year on year. And yet the basic product, Fantasy Premier League in the UK, ESPN Fantasy in the US. The season-long leagues that most people play costs nothing. So how does anyone make money? The answer is the rake. Here is how it works. When you join a free fantasy league, the platform makes nothing directly from you, but when you join a paid contest, a daily fantasy tournament, a prize pool game, a pick'em competition, you pay an entry fee. That entry fee goes into a pool with everyone else's money. The platform distributes roughly 80 to 85% of that pool as prize money and keeps 15 to 20% for itself. That 15 to 20% is called the rake. It sounds small until you do the maths. DraftKings generated $6 billion in revenue in 2025, a 26.9% increase on the previous year. And 2025 was the first year DraftKings posted an annual net profit since it went public in 2018. For context, DraftKings started as a fantasy sports platform in 2012. Its first product was season-long fantasy baseball, a platform where users paid entry fees into leagues, and DraftKings took its rake. By 2026, DraftKings was guiding for full-year revenue of between $6.5 and $6.9 billion, with adjusted EBITDA of between $700 million and $900 million. Its competitor FanDuel, owned by British betting giant Flutter Entertainment, generated $5.79 billion in revenue in 2024. And over $50 billion was wagered on FanDuel in 2024 alone. Between them, DraftKings and FanDuel command 78% of all sports betting gross gaming revenue in the United States. Two companies that started as fantasy sports platforms now control nearly 4/5 of the American sports betting market. Because here is the thing most people don't understand about fantasy sports. It was never really about the fantasy. It was always about the data. Every time you pick a player for your team, every time you make a transfer, every time you check your score at midnight, every time you read an injury update at 6 in the morning, you are generating data. Data about which players you care about, which matches you watch most closely, how engaged you are with specific clubs, how much time you spend on the platform, what content makes you open the app. Dream 11, the dominant fantasy sports platform in India, processes 44 terabytes of data every single day. 44 terabytes. From users selecting cricketers and footballers for virtual teams. That data is extraordinarily valuable. It tells advertisers not just who you are, but what you care about, how you make decisions, and how likely you are to engage with sports-related products. Dream 11 has approximately 220 million users in India, making it one of the largest sports platforms on Earth by user count. And over 70% of those users fall in the 18 to 34 age group, the most valuable advertising demographic on the planet. Dream 11 became India's first gaming unicorn in 2019, and by 2026 was valued at $8 billion. $8 billion. For a platform where the core product is picking 11 cricketers. But the data business is only part of the story, because fantasy sports does something even more valuable for the sport itself. It manufactures engagement. When you have Erling Haaland as your fantasy Premier League captain, you do not just want Manchester City to win, you want Haaland specifically to score twice and get an assist. You watch the entire match. You check the live score feed obsessively. You engage with content about that game that you would otherwise have ignored. The Premier League understands this perfectly. FPL has 11 million registered users in the United Kingdom, generating 30 minutes of additional engagement per user per week, 52 weeks per year. That is the equivalent of 286 million hours of additional attention directed at Premier League players and matches every single year. And the Premier League does not charge a penny for it, because it doesn't need to. Fantasy Premier League is a marketing engine, the best sports marketing engine ever built. And it costs users nothing because the value it generates in broadcast engagement, in shirt sales, in the attention economy, is worth far more than any subscription fee could generate. In 2023 to 2024, Premier League clubs generated £6.3 billion in revenue, a 4% increase on the previous year, with commercial revenue, driven partly by the engagement FPL creates around players and clubs, surpassing £2 billion for the first time. Now here is the story nobody is telling about fantasy sports in 2026, because the industry just faced its biggest crisis, and the platform at the center of it had 220 million users wiped from its paying customer base overnight. On the 21st of August, 2025, Dream 11 paused all paid contests. India's parliament had passed an online gaming bill outlawing real money games, and paid contests, the rake model that accounted for over 90% of Dream 11's income, were suddenly illegal. 220 million users. Overnight, generating zero paid contest revenue. Dream 11 had previously navigated regulatory challenges by arguing successfully that fantasy sports are a game of skill, not gambling. The Indian Supreme Court agreed. Fantasy sports had been legally distinguished from gambling across most Indian states. Then Parliament disagreed. The 2025 gaming bill introduced a 28% goods and services tax on the full face value of bets. Before the bill was even passed, the GST had already triggered consolidation across the Indian fantasy market, with only the most capital-efficient players surviving. It is the most dramatic regulatory intervention in the history of fantasy sports. And it happened in 12 months to an $8 billion company. The lesson for every investor in fantasy sports globally is stark. The rake model works brilliantly, right up until a government decides it doesn't. DraftKings and FanDuel have navigated this risk in the United States by pivoting from daily fantasy sports into full sports betting. As states legalize gambling, the companies move with it, gradually converting their fantasy customer base into sports bettors. DraftKings holds approximately 32% of the US sportsbook market, FanDuel 44%. Between them, they have transformed what began as a free game into a $12 billion annual revenue duopoly. And that is the answer to the original question. Fantasy football is free because the free product builds the user base. The user base generates the data. The data drives the advertising. The advertising funds the free product. And for a subset of the most engaged users, the platform converts free players into paying contest entrants, and paying contest entrants into sports bettors. The free game is not the product. The free game is the funnel. Here is the final number that puts all of it in context. 11 million people in the UK are playing Fantasy Premier League right now for free, generating 286 million hours of annual engagement for the Premier League, which generated £6.3 billion in revenue last season. DraftKings, which started as a fantasy sports platform in 2012, is guiding for $6.9 billion in revenue this year. Dream 11 built an $8 billion empire on 220 million users picking cricketers, then had 90% of its paid revenue paused by a single parliamentary vote. The global fantasy sports market will be worth $67 billion by 2033. And the game you play on your phone on a Saturday morning costs you nothing. Someone else is making all the money. Subscribe to Pitch Deck Report. Every week we find the story behind the scoreline, the business behind the beautiful game.